This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
The United States and South Korea are allies bound by decades of military, economic, and political partnership. But now this alliance is falling apart. It all started with a high-profile raid in Georgia, where federal agents detained nearly 500 people at a Hyundai factory. Workers were escorted out of the workshops, cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, and authorities declared it the largest operation in the agency's history. But there is more to this than meets the eye. This incident has become a symbol of how America, once considered a model of justice, is turning into a country where politics and pride outweigh common sense and alliance commitments.
We begin today's show with President Trump's growing nationwide immigration crackdown as agents arrested dozens in and around Boston this weekend.
On the same day that Georgia officials solemnly spoke of a new era of partnership with South Korea, dozens of Korean specialists were sitting in cells for illegal immigrants. No one on stage mentioned this. Not a word of apology or acknowledgement of error. Only smiles and applause. But in Seoul, everyone noticed the contrast. Television talk shows erupted with discussions. How can you talk about friendship when your allies are being humiliated on American soil? On the internet, Koreans wrote that America no longer sees anyone but itself. That instead of partnership, there is now dictatorship and arrogance. Some directly called on Hyundai to reconsider its investments in the US and bring its money home. After all, the company had invested billions creating jobs and technology for Americans. But in return, it received handcuffs and silence. Even South Korean diplomats, usually cautious in their statements, said that without an official apology, trust could not be restored. Western newspapers picked up on the story. The Wall Street Journal wrote about Hyundai's cold reception after billions in investments. The New York Post asked a direct question: why is the Trump administration responding with raids and arrests after receiving billions in promised investments? For the first time, conservatives and liberals found themselves on the same side, acknowledging that America was losing face.
An illegal alien, and these companies that hire illegal aliens, they undercut the competition as paying U.S. citizens salaries.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, South Korean news programs showed footage from the U.S. protests, armed clashes, closed government agencies. America looked not like an ally, but like a country on the brink of internal crisis. President Donald Trump accused his opponents of terrorism, threatened to send troops against his own citizens, and spoke of enemies within. For Korean viewers, all this sounded frighteningly familiar, like an echo of the times when the authorities in their own country tried to suppress dissent. Thus, a simple story about a Hyundai factory became a mirror reflecting a new reality. The world looks at America and sees not confidence but chaos, not partnership but superiority, not respect but humiliation. And now the question is louder than ever: if this is how America treats its allies, what does it have in store for its relations with the rest of the world? This is not just a scandal involving arrests. It is a signal that even the most powerful nation can lose trust faster than factories can be built and contracts signed. And when pride becomes policy, no one is safe.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
It all started unexpectedly. At dawn, when the shift was just gathering in the workshops, dozens of vans with federal agency logos surrounded the huge Hyundai plant in Georgia. The workers, many of whom had arrived from South Korea on official visas, did not even have time to understand what was happening. People were led out in formation. Their documents were checked, their fingerprints were taken, and they were forced to sign papers whose meaning no one explained. Later, the authorities stated that the operation was directed against violators of immigration law. But eyewitnesses recall that among those detained were engineers, contractors, and specialists in the installation of high-tech equipment, not those who hide from taxes or work illegally. According to the Department of Homeland Security, it was the largest operation in the agency's history, but no official statement explained why Hyundai was targeted. A total of nearly 500 people were arrested. For the state of Georgia, it was a shock. The Hyundai plant is the pride of the region, a symbol of economic partnership with South Korea. Last year alone, the company generated more than $1 billion in tax revenue, and thousands of local residents found jobs thanks to Korean investment. Just a few days before the raid, the authorities held a presentation talking about a new era of prosperity and unprecedented cooperation between the two countries. Cameras filmed smiling officials, and words of friendship and mutual trust were spoken. But just a week later, the very workers who had been held up as an example of successful globalization found themselves in handcuffs.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Local media were initially confused. Some quoted official sources, while others tried to figure out what was hidden behind the phrase verification of legal residence. It soon became clear that those arrested were completely legal. Many had contracts signed at the state level. Their visas had been approved in Seoul and agreed upon with U.S. ministries. But bureaucracy, politics, and, as analysts later wrote, pressure from trade unions did their job. Some sources claimed that the raid was initiated by local trade unions dissatisfied with the fact that key technological positions at the plant were held by Koreans rather than Americans. This episode instantly became a symbol of hypocrisy. America, which had been talking about the free market, equal opportunities, and global partnership for decades, suddenly showed a completely different face. No apologies followed. Factory representatives declined to comment, and Georgia officials limited themselves to a dry statement: "The law is the law." Korean news outlets began to talk about the humiliation of allies. One SBS anchor noted, "They call us partners as long as we invest, but as soon as we make money, they turn us into criminals."
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Meanwhile, a solemn event was being held in Georgia, an economic forum dedicated to cooperation with South Korea. On stage were American officials, investors, and representative chambers of commerce. Everyone talked about unshakable friendship, thousands of jobs, and Hyundai's contribution to America's future. But no one even mentioned the hundreds of people who were sitting in migrant detention centers at that very moment. Among the guests were diplomats from Seoul. When they were given the floor, the atmosphere changed. One of the representatives, maintaining outward calm, said that such events cannot but affect the level of trust between countries. His words sounded like a cold shower. Silence hung in the hall. Several American participants tried to defuse the situation with jokes, but the tension was obvious. A wave of outrage began on South Korean social media. Comments filled platforms from Naver to KakaoTalk. "They call us friends, but treat us like enemies," users wrote. Others pointed out that Hyundai had invested billions of dollars in Setback, the American economy, created thousands of jobs, and was now forced to justify its presence. "Let Trump apologize, then we'll talk about partnership," was the refrain under every post about the incident.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Some users recalled that just a few years ago, Donald Trump personally called South Korean companies an example of the right kind of investment. He posed for cameras next to Hyundai cars and promised support and incentives. But after the raid, everything changed. Korean analysts began to talk about betraying the interests of an ally for the sake of domestic politics. In their opinion, the raid was a show of force for the electorate, a gesture designed to show that the administration controls foreign influence on American industry. Rumors heightened tensions. Some Korean publications wrote that before the raid, officials from Georgia met with union representatives who demanded equal conditions for American workers. There is no official confirmation of this, but the coincidence seemed too precise. Even American economists began to ask questions. Why risk a strategic partnership for political points? While the American authorities remained silent, South Korean society was in turmoil. The major television channels KEBS, MEEPS, jet-aired debates in which experts compared Washington's behavior to colonial arrogance. One economics professor said live on air, "They have forgotten that an alliance is based not on laws but on trust. If trust is broken, no contract can save it." These words were quoted thousands of times.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Meanwhile, People began to gather with placards outside the US Embassy in Seoul. The protest was peaceful but symbolic. The banners depicted the US flag with the stripes turning into handcuffs. Among the participants were former Hyundai employees, students, and union representatives. Their slogan was simple: partnership means respect. Within South Korea itself, talks began about revising investment strategies. Several large corporations, including auto parts suppliers, froze projects in the US, awaiting Washington's response. Experts warned that if the situation did not change, billions of dollars could be redirected to domestic markets or Southeast Asian countries. American publications gradually began to pick up on the topic. The Wall Street Journal published an article titled "Hyundai Gets Cold Shoulder from Trump Despite Charm Offensive." It pointed out that the South Korean company had promised to create thousands of jobs and build a modern factory, but instead of gratitude, it received searches and arrests. Even the conservative New York Post wrote that Washington itself is undermining confidence in American industrial policy.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This media coverage only added to the annoyance in Seoul. South Korean TV channels showed footage of American officials talking about a great partnership, while behind the scenes there were shots of people in handcuffs. The contrast was too obvious to ignore. The anchors commented ironically, "When America talks about freedom, it means freedom to act without consequences." Behind the scenes, South Korean government officials discussed the possibility of an official protest. Diplomats insisted on an apology, even though they understood that the Trump administration was not inclined to admit mistakes. At an economic forum in Seoul dedicated to international investment, one of the speakers said bluntly, "If America doesn't respect those boats invest money in it, why go there at all?" These words were met with applause. A few weeks later, Hyundai began cutting costs on American projects. Officially, this was due to budget optimization, but everyone understood that the reason was deeper. It was a quiet but expressive warning. In financial circles, there was even talk of a capital repatriation.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
Thus, a routine raid turned into a diplomatic crisis. America, accustomed to dictating the rules, suddenly found itself facing a mirror that reflected its own contradictions. South Korea, which had long considered the US a guarantor of stability, openly questioned that status for the first time. And the world watched as, under the guise of partnership, the features of a new political realism emerged, where even allies become victims of someone else's ambitions. And the longer Washington remained silent, the louder Seoul's voice became, without demanding revenge or threatening sanctions, but simply reminding everyone that respect cannot be bought, even with billions of dollars of investment. The story of the raid on the Hyundai plant in Georgia quickly grew beyond the scope of a local incident. Within a few days, leading American publications were writing about it, and the tone of the publications was unexpectedly unanimous. Something had gone wrong. Even traditionally conservative media outlets loyal to the Donald Trump administration could not ignore the obvious contradiction between official statements about a great partnership with South Korea and the rough treatment of its citizens. The Wall Street Journal published an article stating outright that after billions in investments, Hyundai was met with a cold reception and political indifference. The newspaper emphasized that the company had fulfilled all its obligations, and the arrests of its specialists were a blow to business confidence in American guarantees. A day later, the New York Post, a publication that rarely criticizes Trump, came out with an even harsher headline: "Hyundai showered Trump with cash, gets handcuffs in return." It was a signal even the president's supporters were beginning to doubt his strategy.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state. And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
These articles were instantly picked up by the South Korean media. Jetbank Kebs showed screenshots of American publications with translations of the headlines. Commentators spoke of a shift in the perception of America within America itself, noting that for the first time in the history of the alliance, criticism of the US was coming not from opponents, but from their own allied media. Yim aired a story where footage of the arrests was accompanied by quotes from American newspapers. And the host said, even within the US, they understand that this is a disgrace. However, in the United States itself, the reaction was more mixed. Administration officials tried to justify the actions of the Georgian authorities, stating that the law applies to everyone without exception. At one of the briefings, the White House press secretary avoided giving a direct answer to the question of whether the government would apologize to Seoul. Meanwhile, Trump supporters on Conservative Talk shows presented the situation as an example of a tough approach to foreign corporations. One analyst on Fox News said, America has allowed foreigners to dictate their rules for too long. Now they have to play by ours. These words only added to the irritation in Seoul.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The next day, South Korean TV channels showed a selection of American news stories featuring similar comments. To the Korean audience, this looked like a display of arrogance. The presenter said outright that America has confused its partners with its competitors. Journalists interviewed passers-by on the streets of Seoul. One man said, if they don't want to see us as allies, why should we continue to play this game? This short clip later spread across social media, becoming a symbol of growing mistrust. Gradually, the story went beyond the economic sphere. In Korea, people began to say that the raid was a reflection of a broader disease, the crisis of the American image. In the past, the US was seen as the benchmark for democracy and justice, but now its image was rapidly changing. Against the backdrop of internal turmoil, protests, political scandals, Trump's harsh rhetoric, the arrests of foreign workers seemed not accidental, but inevitable. Korean talk shows increasingly echoed the idea that America was losing its moral right to teach others about democracy.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
American television channels, meanwhile, showed a duality. CNN and MSNBC tried to view the conflict with Hyundai in the context of Trump's trade policy. In one report, a correspondent in Seoul noted, South Korea increasingly perceives the US as an unpredictable partner. This story resonated within America as well, because it raised a direct question. Should allies trust a country where decisions depend on the mood of one person? Meanwhile, South Korea was actively discussing footage from the US, where Trump spoke of internal enemies and the need to restore order by force. Against the backdrop of these speeches, the arrest of Korean engineers looked not just like an incident, but a manifestation of a general policy, a policy of intimidation and demonstration of force. In one program on SBS, the host said, when the leader of a country talks about using the army against his own citizens, it's not surprising that he treats his allies with the same contempt.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
These words were not an exaggeration. South Korean viewers saw footage of American protests, police in riot gear, closed government offices, and Trump's offensive tweets. All of this shaped the image of a country in chaos. The reports were accompanied by comments that America is losing its composure. One episode showed a montage of American officials who, according to the host, cannot distinguish between a crisis of confidence and pre-election PR. Gradually, economic experts joined the discussion. In analytical programs on Korean television, they explained that the crisis of confidence would affect not only politics but also the markets. If companies begin to doubt the stability of American regulations, investments will move to Europe or Southeast Asia. One commentator noted, America no longer looks like a safe haven. It looks like a storm. This image instantly became a meme on the internet.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Within the US, the growing irritation of its allies began to be noticed. The New York Times published a column in which the author wrote that Trump is tearing down alliances faster than he is building walls. The article emphasized that such episodes are not accidental, but the result of a policy based on pride. According to the author, Seoul was the first country to openly hold up a mirror to Washington. By this point, Korean television channels had begun to talk about what was happening not as a conflict, but as a symptom of a disease. America is tired of itself, said one of the hosts. The reports were accompanied by footage of empty government buildings in Washington, signs reading closed due to shutdown, protests, and aggressive slogans. To Korean audiences, it looked like a film about the collapse of a great power.